Well, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where in the world you happen to be. And I, as always, want to give a very special Carnegie welcome to any viewers who might be live streaming us from Europe or Asia, which are the two regions that are actually at the core of the discussion we're going to have today. I'm Evan Feigenbaum. I'm Vice President for Studies at Carnegie. And, when I first met one of our panelists, who you should see on screen already, General Charles Hooper, in the mid 1980s, sorry, actually in the mid 1990s, the Chinese People's Liberation Army was already pretty deep into the process of learning lessons from the first Gulf War, the one where the United States reversed the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. That war was in 1991. It was a conventional war. And so it featured infantry and tanks, which were at the heart of the PLA fighting force. But as all of you will remember, it also featured the integration and deployment of a lot of technology, much of which helped to drive the outcome from the American perspective of the combat. And in fact, much of that technology involved things that observers in China got a look at for the very first time during the course of that war. And that in turn, in the 1990s, ushered in a whole lot of thinking in China throughout that decade about whether there was a revolution in military affairs, an RMA, as they put it, underway. PLA planners started to think and write and talk about integrating digital technologies. They became interested in so-called network-centric warfare. They started to debate strategy and tactics and operations in new ways that were designed to assimilate some of the lessons of what they'd observed in the Gulf. And we've seen many more rounds of PLA learning, debate, assimilation, and adaptation over these subsequent decades. So if we fast forward to today, there's another massive conventional war underway, this time in the very heart of Europe. And on one side of that fight is Russia, which is a country that is China's close strategic partner, and with which China has had a great many military and technological exchanges over the last decade in particular. And so we wanted to get a few deep thinkers about the PLA together to reflect on what the Chinese may now be learning or unlearning as a result of, if I may say so, the horror show that is unfolding in Ukraine on a daily basis. Now, to me, one question, of course, is how, when, and why the PLA learns in the first place. How adaptive is the PLA? How observant are they of what is happening at the strategic, tactical, and operational level? And do they have a modus operandi from learning from foreign militaries and foreign conflicts? That's the general question. Another question is the relevance of what's unfolding in the heart of Europe for the contingencies that matter to PLA planners, not least in the Taiwan Strait. What specifically might they be taking away, and where do we expect them to make changes, if at all? There's also the question, I think, of what the PLA may have done right that Russia has clearly done wrong. One example that springs to my mind is reforms around creating a non-commissioned officer corps, for example, something that Russia seems to have failed at, but that China's had at least a run at. And there's also the question of what exactly any putative PLA learning and adaptation means for the United States and for the world, not least because, let's face it, the United States military might end up having to fight China force on force someday, and both sides are planning around that. So in that context, I'm incredibly pleased to welcome an all-star team of very good friends and colleagues to just kick this around with me. So I'll introduce them quickly. First, as I said, General Charles Hooper, or Hoop, as we affectionately know him. Hoop, we've known each other since, 1994, I think, or 95, when we met in China. He's a non-resident scholar, actually, in the Asia program here at Carnegie, but he's affiliated with a lot of other organizations too, including the Kennedy School at Harvard, the Atlantic Council, and the Cohen Group. Hoop was the senior director for China and Taiwan policy in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. He was the U.S. Defense Attaché to China, and he was Deputy Director of Strategy at U.S. Indo-Pacific Command. He was also the head of the Defense Security Cooperation Agency. He retired as a lieutenant general with 3 stars on his shoulders. Bonnie Lin is a senior fellow for Asian security and director of the China Power Project at our neighbor, the Center for Strategic and International Studies down the street. She used to be at the RAND Corporation. She was also in the Office of the Secretary of Defense from 2015 to 18, where she was director for Taiwan. She was country director for China, senior advisor for China, and a very trenchant observer of Chinese military developments. And finally, Joel Wuthnow, who's the senior research fellow in the Center for the Study of Chinese Military Affairs at the National Defense University. Joel is also an adjunct professor in the Security Studies program at Georgetown. I read all their stuff. I learned a lot from these three. I know you will too. They're close students of the PLA. They're trenchant analysts. So team, welcome. And I was thinking we could start with this more general question of learning. And Hoop, I thought I'd start with you, because you've got the benefit of perspective. You've observed the PLA for a long time. You've been defense attaché. And so you have the benefit of both a long time horizon to see the evolution, but also, I think, of a comparative perspective because of other roles you've had in the service and beyond. So as you've been watching this since, let's say, the time we met, or if you want to extend the time horizon back a little further, talk to us a little bit about how we should think about the role of learning in the Chinese armed forces. How important are foreign military engagements, doctrines, conflicts for them? What's the system through which they learn, and how much do they observe and adapt in a general sense before we get to the question of Ukraine?
Well, thank you very much, Evan, for that wonderful introduction, and no pressure here to perform. Before we start, when you talk about learning, I'm reminded of something my father used to say when I was young, and he'd hear people talk about some youth who had repeatedly said or done illegal or immoral or bad things, and he hears someone else say, well, I hope he or she has learned their lesson. And my dad would say, it's only a lesson if they actually learn something. And I remember thinking when I was young, oh, well, yeah, Dad, that's kind of self-evident. But what he was really trying to say was, it's only a lesson learned if the information produces a positive and beneficial change in personal, strategic, or organizational behavior. Otherwise, it's just an observation. It's not a lesson. The student or the observer, in this case, the PLA, must have both the willingness and the ability to change. And in the case of China, that would be essentially the political willingness and the cultural ability for this institution, the PLA, to change. And so I wanted to start off with that kind of anecdote as we study how the PLA might learn. The PLA, let's start from the beginning, are careful and meticulous students of modern warfare, particularly the US way of war. They are voracious consumers of publicly available information, as well as all of the information that their very aggressive intelligence efforts provide them. And I used to tell when I was the defense attaché and at PAPECOM and in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, I used to say, if it's online, they've read it. And I remember being in meetings where they would quote word for word any doctrine that we had posted online or revisions to our doctrine, as well as the performance capabilities of US weapon systems. So they are studying it. They are voracious. And as we've seen evidence of in their military buildup and their defense modernization, they've demonstrated both the willingness and the ability. PLA analytical emphasis is focused primarily on the universal objective metrics of military capabilities and comprehensive national power. And they're focused on many of the traditional elements, such as the kinetics, mechanics, and metallurgy of tanks, planes, and ships, and the munitions that they carry. And not surprisingly, as we've watched their technological development, they are also carefully studying the elements of the modern hybrid battlefield. So information warfare, of course, the role of asymmetric systems, such as the Javelin and the Switchblade in the case of Ukraine, cyber and space technology, strategic communications, but not only military strategic communications, but civilian strategic communications as well. I think we would all agree that the advent or the introduction of Starlink, which is an essentially civilian system into Ukraine, has made a fundamental difference in that battle. Hypersonic and directed energy technology, AI and machine learning applications, maritime and aerospace operations, logistics, supply chains, geography, meteorology, study of the weather, and even in the case of Taiwan, oceanography, because of the tides in the Taiwan Strait, there's only certain times where you could for perhaps consider an amphibious invasion. So as I stated earlier, these measures of battlefield efficiency are common to all militaries and largely objective in nature. So as a result, they're relatively easy to study, catalog, and modify, and we can be sure that the PLA is studying all of these very carefully, as they have since the revolution in military affairs, a term, by the way, coined by one of my heroes and mentors, Andy Marshall. May he rest in peace. And I believe the PLA's clearly demonstrated both the willingness and the ability to make any adjustments, and their entire defensive modernization effort is evidence of that. Equally important, they are observing the evolving operational doctrine and combat leadership, or what we in the US call battle command performance, of both Russian and Ukrainian forces and US forces as well. And if you notice, I listed those last. It's because the formulation and execution of doctrine and combat leadership are far more subjective in nature. They're far more art than science, and far more dependent on institutional and anthropological culture and human capital development than technological capabilities listed above. And so with that in mind, the PLA analysis and their ability to learn from other militaries is bounded in a sense, and some might say restricted, by their own bureaucratic and political organization and institutional culture and historical biases. So despite recent organizational reform efforts, the PLA remains essentially a political entity with a warfighting mission. It is a party army, not a national army, okay? And its approach to learning and leadership is heavily influenced by its own organization, as well as traditional Chinese culture and education. And so, for example, one of the principal elements of the initial Russian military failures in Ukraine is a function of command and control, poor leadership development, internal corruption, inadequate training, and poor troop motivations. In the PLA system, development of these key capabilities is a communist party and not a strictly military responsibility. And Xi Jinping himself has acknowledged this in such examples as his Wuge Buhui, the 5 incapables, the 5 things that PLA military officers and leaders cannot do but should be able to do in modern warfare. And so the question becomes, and this is a historical issue with the PLA, how will the party address these military shortcomings? Okay, in US military tradition, very public acknowledgement of doctrinal material training and technological shortfalls, failures, and missteps often serves as a prelude to addressing capabilities gaps. And we're seeing this now as we've acknowledged the gaps we may have with China, and we're racing to address those gaps. And we see this in our efforts, and this has all been cataloged by authors such as Christian Bowes and the Kill Chain and others. But despite mirror imaging rhetoric in PLA publications, this type of self-criticism and acknowledgement of failure as a prelude to reform and redemption is not really an element of CCP institutional or educational culture. So in short, they have demonstrated the ability and the capacity to learn, and they've been studying the US way of war, and in fact, all conflicts worldwide for many, many years. The question is, what do they have the ability to change, and how fast can they change it? And I'll stop there.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Can I push you guys on this? And maybe I'll kick this to Bonnie, but then Joel or Hoop, any of you guys should weigh in. This point that Hoop made about organizational culture, you can have the will to learn, you can voraciously read everything, you absorb everything, you want to learn about the US way of war, but you may or may not have organizational barriers from your own institutional culture that prevent you from doing that. That really is, that to me is the core question. What I remember most about talking to PLA people in the 1990s, when I was a graduate student and I was doing research on the military technology complex in China, the 2 things when they would talk about the American way of war that they seemed most obsessed with, one was obviously technology. How do you integrate technology into the force and into combat? But the second was jointness. The way the US was combining, combined arms, combined operations, doing joint everything, joint training, not just joint operations, joint training, a culture of jointness, because they didn't have it. And so, they would talk, they had studied Goldwater Nichols, and they were interested in the way that all of the joint structures operated. But I always wondered whether the culture of the organization really, beyond the rhetoric, would be able to assimilate that. And then that flows into the more generalizable question. do they have a cultural barrier or an institutional set of barriers, either because of their legacy or their history, or as who put it, the party nature of the army, some ideological element that precludes that? And where do you see the challenges, and where do you see them actually being able to break through those organizational barriers? So Bonnie, why don't we go to you?
Sure. I think perhaps Joel, who's done quite a bit of work on the organization, institutional and culture of the PLA, might be better positioned to answer some of these questions. But I'll add another question on top of that. In addition to organizational issues, the other thing to think about is as the PLA looks at, for example, what Russia is doing, what Ukraine is doing, or any of its prior conflicts, they also have priors that they come into, right? We know that the PLA has been reforming for quite some time. So how much does watching what Russia is doing in Ukraine reinforce their prior direction for reforming the PLA? And how much does it actually cause the PLA to change and switch courses? My sense overall is I don't think so far what we're seeing in terms of overall PLA lessons learned from Ukraine is causing the PLA to significantly rethink what it's doing, except it's reinforcing a lot of what the PLA had said for some time, right? For example, information dominance, the importance of being able to seize the initiative. I think a lot of these we can talk about in the second portion when we delve into Ukraine. But a key question to ask is, in addition to organization challenges, what are the prior assumptions the PLA have about war, and how much does Russia, Ukraine reinforce those assumptions versus allow them to learn new things? What I did want to add on to in terms of what Lieutenant General Hooper mentioned was how much detail the PLA focus on when it comes to looking at the conflicts. And here I think it will be useful to go back to some of the key texts the PLA has commissioned after some of these major wars. For example, the research into Kosovo War or the research into the Iraq War. Some of these texts come out a year or two after the war has ended. And I think it'll just be interesting for the audience to have a sense of the very detailed questions these massive texts, which are 200 or 300 pages, seek to address, analyzing each of the wars. So for example, if you group the questions together, one of the key questions they ask is, what was the situation leading up to the war? What caused the war? And here they don't give, for example, a one paragraph description. Sometimes they go back as far as 20, 30 years, or even 100 years prior to the conflict to trace the origins. I'm sure they're doing that for Russia, Ukraine. They're probably not starting in 2022 when looking at the cause. They might be going even beyond 2014. Other questions they address when looking at conflict include, how did the war unfold? How did the course of war change over time? So there might be lessons learned early on in a war versus later on. What were the basic characteristics of warfare? What were the major fighting methods, primary tactics? What was the final impact of war? And how did all the different parties learn? So as we look at, for example, Russia's takeaways from Ukraine, given how extensive these studies were, it is almost too early. Sorry, as we look at how the PLA learns from Russia's operations in Ukraine, it's almost too early to make any definitive conclusions. And so far, I don't know if Joel and General Hooper are saying this, what we're seeing are only snippets of initial conclusions or initial findings from PLA or Chinese military strategists. I think what we'll share today are what we think might be going on, but we probably won't know maybe until a year or maybe more from now. We won't see these more definitive texts. And then even after we see these texts, it will take a while for the lessons learned to actually translate it into changes in doctrine, into changes in planning in terms of investments. So it'll actually take some time. But I did want to share that as the PLA look at this, exactly like General Hooper mentioned, it's very detail oriented, very comprehensive, but it will take time. So we shouldn't expect any major changes from the PLA from Russia's invasion of Ukraine in the next year or two. It might take 3 or 4 years, or maybe 10 or so years from now.
Great. Joel, why don't I just kick it to you? Why don't you come in on some of these questions?
Thanks, Evan. So I guess let me kind of start by saying that it's not surprising. All the major militaries are looking at foreign conflicts and trying to figure out what's going on other battlefields, and trying to understand both what the offense is doing, what the defense is doing, and so on, and whether there are lessons. The U.S. is looking at the Ukraine crisis just as China is. So it's not surprising that the PLA would be looking at this, but I would say it's particularly important though for the PLA because they themselves have not been engaged in conflict for so long. It's really now been 40 plus years. Almost nobody in the PLA has ever been in a war. And so for them, looking at the foreign battlefields is really sort of a crutch. I mean, you have to look at it because you yourselves aren't drawing from your own experiences. So, really the question here, I think, is, what does it mean? The PLA is an observing organization, but I think to Hoop's point, are they really a learning organization? Are they trying to build in these lessons that some of their scholars are sort of distilling from foreign conflicts and really making actual changes to the PLA? And so that gets to your question, Evan, which is whether or not there might be some sort of a tension here between, on the one hand, a motivation to try to copy or to try to emulate or to bring in or to innovate based on foreign examples on one hand, and then on the other hand, well, all the pre-existing organizational structure, the legacies, the traditions, the systems that are in place, if they can't just wish away. So they're grafting onto something that is already in existence that might not fit so easily with the thing they're trying to emulate. So one example of this is the PLA in recent years has gone through this massive organizational reform, one of the operational points of which was to become more joint. And so they've changed the command and control system. They seem to want to be able to do jointness better. And of course, Russia has failed to do that really well in Ukraine. And I think the Chinese are looking at that as a cautionary tale of what happens if you don't get jointness correct. So I think, the PLA is looking at this and they're saying, well, this reaffirms our notion of jointness, and that confirms the goals that we've set for ourselves over the last 5 or 7 or 8 years to become more joint, which is really kind of an American way of war. They look at the Gulf War and drew similar inspirations from that. But on the other hand, you have features of the PLA system that make jointness very difficult, or at least jointness in the American mode very difficult. And I think Hoop kind of started to get into that when he talked about the PLA as a party army. But I think, specifically some of the constraints in their system include the nature of the political work apparatus. So the consensus decision-making at each level of the PLA, you have a commander, but also a political commissar, but also a committee that's supposed to talk about things and, make decisions, which is very unlike the American way of war where you have a commander. And then also the tendency in the PLA towards centralization, so they are not particularly comfortable, I think, even nowadays with pushing a lot of autonomy down to lower commanders. And so the kind of organizational culture is to want to look as far up as possible and to have someone really at the pinnacle of the system say, yes, please do that explicitly, because that's just really how Leninist systems work. That they prioritize, they prize the decision making at the highest possible level by the smallest group of people because they're not particularly comfortable with other humans. And so they're thinking through these questions. There's some part of the PLA that thinks, well, what happens if we outsource some of that decision making to AI? Right, this is sort of a chimera, sort of an idea. Can you short circuit around human beings? But again, all this becomes sort of a constraint in the heat of modern conflict, which is very fast paced and which requires commanders to make very difficult decisions under pressure and not necessarily have to wait for a committee to make a decision or for Xi Jinping or someone at the top to make an explicit decision about something. And so I do think there are certain barriers, and I think ultimately there are ways in which the U.S., as we think about a potential conflict with China, can harness some of those constraints and tensions in that system, the slower decision-making, more cautious attitudes about all of this, to be able to ultimately, I think, potentially deter China more effectively.
So before we get to Ukraine, so China, as you said, this is a Leninist system. Decision-making is centralized, but there is ferment and there is debate in the system. And historically within the PLA, there's been debate in which some views prevail and some views end up getting eclipsed, sometimes for political reasons, sometimes for operational reasons. So one example, I actually wrote my doctoral dissertation on this. In the 1950s and 60s, there were debates about the implications of the nuclear age, right? That pitted marshals and generals of the PLA against each other. Should we emphasize conventional weapons, conventional warfare? Should we put more emphasis on strategic weapons, strategic warfare? It's not a perfect one-to-one example, but the point is there's always been some debate in the system. I'm wondering, are there views in the PLA that have basically become obsolete and that have been taken out of the debate in the last 5 to 10 years because of things that they have observed in foreign military situations, whether it's the US fighting in Iraq or Afghanistan. Afghanistan, maybe not the best example because it was counterinsurgency, but Iraq, Ukraine. Are there views in the PLA that are really no longer relevant, that have had the legs cut out from under them because of what they've observed overseas? So essentially, the observational army is, I like the way you put it, an observational army, but not necessarily a learning army. The observational army learned enough to realize that some of what they would observe meant some options had to be put off the table entirely, and they needed to think differently. Is there anything that's become obsolete?
I'll take a step. There's two things I think that have fundamentally changed over the past 40 years. The first of those is this concept among the PLA leadership that they had the advantage of defense in depth, and as a result, they didn't necessarily need to develop even a limited power projection capability. And I can remember years ago, PLA generals telling me, well, you know, if you attack Tianjin, we'll fall back to Beijing, and if you attack Beijing, we'll fall back to Chengdu. And I remember thinking, why in the world would we do that? You know, so and that's fundamentally changed, and we see the defense modernization focused on giving them the ability to have a limited power projection capability, if only for anti-axis area denial. So that's the first thing I think that's fundamentally changed. The second is the concept that they have an overwhelming advantage in mass, that quantity has a quality of its own. Now, quantity still does have a quality of its own, but qualitative quantity has an even higher quality all its own. And so there's been an abandonment of this perception that we have this overwhelming advantage of mass, and that's sufficient to deter an enemy from attacking, and more of an emphasis on reducing the size of the PLA ground forces, increasing the quality of the strategic rocket forces, the support forces, and the Navy in an effort to ensure that their quality matches the qualitative advantage that the United States has always enjoyed. And I'll stop there.
I guess just to kind of build on what Hoop said with respect to sort of the big army mentality, this is an area where I think, you know, the PLA has really made significant strides, especially over the last about 5 to 10 years or so. And this is important because the PLA historically was mainly an army, mainly a ground force, with the Navy, the Air Force, and the others as kind of appendages of the Army. But I do think in recent years, they have gotten to the point where the Army has been really trimmed down. The influence of the Army in terms of the leadership has diminished. And they've also understood they've cut, recently they cut 5 group armies. That's a big deal for them. So they're down to 13. In Ukraine, I think they've had to sort of revisit something of ground force tactics and ground force maneuver warfare in particular because of the Russia's inability. And here I say, you know, we're talking about the PLA as a learning organization and observing. Well, they're also observing the Russians, and quite a lot of the modern ground force structure of the PLA is based on the Russian system. And yet what we've seen in Ukraine has been those battalions and brigades, these smaller maneuver units, not perform particularly well because of the limited support they're able to muster. And this is very problematic for the PLA because they went almost all in on this Russian style ground force structure. They got rid of divisions, most of the regiments, they've gone down to brigades and battalions. They've really outdone the Russians on this very model. And so I think when they're looking at the future, they're going to look at Russia's inability. And in fact, Russia brought back some divisions and so on after the Crimean conflict in 2014. And so I think this may be one of the most important areas of learning from Ukraine for the PLA, is whether they've gone too far in slicing off important pieces of the ground forces, and they may actually revisit that so that they're not stuck in a similar quagmire in Taiwan, for instance.
Yeah, you actually preempted what I was going to ask you next, which is how Russified is the PLA? They've had so many exchanges with the Russians over the last decade. A lot of them are technological exchanges, but they have all sorts of exchanges on all sorts of things. And I was wondering how much of an impact Russian thinking, you know, but before February 24th, when people expected more from the Russian model than what we've seen in performance on the ground, how influential that was for the PLA.
Well, just to take an initial stab, I mean, I would say, first of all, the Chinese look at the major militaries. And I think as Americans, we sometimes fall into the trap of saying they really just want to be like us, when in fact, there are just as many, if not more, PLA analysts who are Russia experts, who are understanding Russian military reforms in the era of Putin and Medvedev and so on. And I think they have actually copied some parts of their structure from the Russian. For example, the theater command system of the PLA, 5 theater commands, are very similar to the Russian military districts in some ways, much less similar to our geographic combatant commands, which are global in nature. So I think they studied the Russian military districts. They train with the Russians. They have their most high-end exercises are with the Russians. And so that's their really one opportunity to learn from a combat credible force. It's certainly not exchanges with us. But Pakistan and Russia are really the two examples where they can go and learn tactics, techniques, and procedures from a force that has actually been battle tested. But again, with any of these parallels or examples, I don't think we want to go too far and to make a claim that the PLA has been sort of Russified, because there are elements of that, but there are elements where they have been Americanized and elements where they remain Sinicized. And so, I think it's a piece of it, but it comes up with other constraints. It can do something for them, but it can't do everything for them.
Okay. So Bonnie, walk us through kind of your initial conclusions. Maybe conclusions isn't the right word because it's early innings, but walk us through your initial thoughts on how they may or may not be looking at what's happening in Ukraine. I mean, things have not exactly gone according to plan for the Russians, who have not once, but at least twice adjusted their objectives and their plan and the geographic locus of the combat, and are fighting differently and maybe learning themselves in the process. How relevant is what's happening in Ukraine to the way the PLA projects forward future experience? And I don't just mean lessons from the combat. I mean things that they may have done, for example, that the Russians did not do, where they're actually feeling better about how they're positioned. What if you were sitting in Beijing and you were in the Bai building and you were looking at what's your initial kind of high level take on what they're observing?
Sure. And Evan, before that, maybe I could just jump in really quickly on the China-Russia relationship.
Sure.
I think one thing to note is, as the PLA observes how Russia is performing in Ukraine, I think there are probably more questions as to the value of continued training with the Russians moving forward. But I think one thing that's important to point out is, at the end of the day, the China-Russia relationship is a political one. So even if the PLA might not assess that they have too much value from the training, they might have to do so as part of supporting the overall China-Russia strategic relationship. So I think one thing to focus on moving forward is it might not be as easy to differentiate in what areas is China actually training with Russia, because they actually see significant value from those exercises, and in what ways those exercises are more of a political symbolism of the overall China-Russia relationship, which China sees as quite important, given that it really doesn't have too many other close partners of the same capability. In terms of top level, particularly the highest level takeaways that China is taking from Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I think if we even a step further in looking not only at what the PLA might be taking away, but what the Chinese leadership is taking away, I think one very high level lesson is, in general, that China's security environment has become much more uncertain and in many ways worsened. So China is seeing that the world is becoming increasingly divided between authoritarian and democracy lines. China is seeing a significant fragmentation afterwards, and China is seeing that, from their perspective, that the United States is trying to use Ukraine to revitalize and expand military alliances, not only in Europe, but also in the Indo-Pacific. China is seeing that, from its perspective, that the United States is trying to link Taiwan to Ukraine, which is making it much more difficult for China. So when we put all of these factors together, I would say there are 3 very high-level assessments that Beijing is likely taking away that has implications for how the PLA thinks. One is it's reinforcing China's zero-sum mentality and worries about external forces broadly against China, not just about Taiwan, but also potentially South China Sea and other conflicts. This means that the PLA has been very ready to defend Chinese interests. It also means, as China looks at Ukraine, it's not taking away, for example, what it took away broadly from US involvement in Iraq, which is it created a window of strategic opportunity for China to develop and not having to worry about.
Oh, Bonnie froze. Okay, so she may need to disconnect and come back. So why don't I kick the same question to Hoop? And particularly Hoop, Bonnie, there was kind of a throwaway in what she was saying, but she said, a lot of people here in the United States, Americans, are making this link between Ukraine and Taiwan. I wonder whether the Chinese are making any link. Oh, Bonnie, you're back. So why don't you continue your thought?
I'm so sorry. I'm not sure what's happening with my internet.
No problem.
I don't know where I got cut off, but I was saying the main thing I think from China's perspective is that as it sees its security environment worsen, the PLA has to be much more prepared to defend Chinese interests across the board. And China is not seeing, for example, a window of strategic opportunity opening as a result of Ukraine. That's what China had assessed after the Iraq War, right? That's not the case for Ukraine. In fact, it's seeing its environment become much more problematic. Another very high level assessment that we're seeing is that as Chinese strategists are writing about Ukraine, they're increasingly worried about the effects of hybrid warfare and the effects of proxy war. They're recognizing that what's happening in Ukraine is not just Russia against Ukraine. From their perspective, it's literally Russia against the West, right? It's the United States, NATO, a number of countries supporting Ukraine, whether militarily, economically, or through other means. So as China looks to its periphery, it has to wonder moving forward that if it gets into conflict with any of its neighbors, will it also face a proxy war situation in which, even though they might be facing against Taiwan or Vietnam, that neighbor might have significant backing from the United States or a number of countries and it might not even involve conventional forces there, but there could be significant involvement in which China, even in a limited conflict, could be facing a proxy war situation.
Yeah, of course, it's a political decision to deny the Ukrainians agency by making the United States the culprit. And in fact, they've been very consistent since February 24th. NATO expansion is the rationale. The United States is the culprit. So on the one hand, it denies the Ukrainians some agency. And second, it allows them, I think, at a strategic level, to make some linkage between what they're facing in the Indo-Pacific and what's happening on European security. They took a strong interest in European security, I recall, in the 1990s, especially in the Balkans. But then they sort of looked elsewhere for a couple of decades. Suddenly, they're making this alliance connection, as the US is doing with NATO. That's what it's doing with its Indo-Pacific alliances. This is a trouble for China's security environment. But it's striking to me because it denies local agency to Ukrainians, and it also absolves the Russians of actually being the instigator of the conflict in a way. It allows them to point the finger at the US. It makes sense. I can see why they're doing it from their perspective. Hoop, do you want to have a shot at this question? I also, Bonnie made this point about that Americans, I was saying this, Bonnie, while you dropped, that you said Americans and others make this link between Ukraine and Taiwan. And I was asking whether the Chinese, in fact, make that link. I mean, Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine on February 24th. China, as we all know, has spent, a couple of decades thinking about ways to coerce Taiwan, kinetically and non-kinetically. They didn't just wake up on the 24th and start thinking about it. So what's happened since the 24th that might be relevant to Taiwan, at the operational level, but also at the strategic?
Well, yeah, Evan, and I have, as you might imagine, I talk about this a lot, and I have a whole list of things that they've observed and that have changed since the war in Ukraine started. But I think at the very strategic military level, one of the most fundamental tenets of PLA modernization has actually been validated by the Ukraine conflict, but it's also paradoxical. And let me explain what I mean. The evolving character, as we know, the nature of warfare never changes. The applications of violence to achieve a political end. But the character of warfare is constantly evolving. And what we're seeing now is an evolution of the character of warfare towards the defense as opposed to the offense. The defense or the defending nation has an advantage here. And in Europe, Russia clearly possessed an overwhelming advantage, or at least we perceived an overwhelming advantage in combat power and just sheer throw weight when compared to Ukraine. But despite this, Ukraine has been able to offset this advantage by a skillful application of asymmetric military capabilities that have been supplied by its allies and partners in this instance. Now, What we need to understand is the PLA has always perceived themselves to be the defender and the US to be the aggressor. We tend to look at it, because of the Taiwan element of it, as China being the aggressor and us being the defender, but that's not how they see it. They see themselves as the defender and the US as the attacker. And indeed, their entire defense modernization, emphasis on anti-access area denial, the so-called shashogen, the assassin's mace, has been specifically focused on denying the United States the ability to project power into the Western Pacific and to prevent us from building it's always often been described as the mountains of iron. Before we go to war anywhere in the world, we build a mountain of iron in Kuwait, in Iraq, and in other places, and then we unleash this mountain of iron on whoever our foe is far from our shores. The paradox here is that while the United States is clearly the aggressor and attacker, within this paradigm, Taiwan is clearly the defender. And the Ukraine conflict, as I just mentioned, has clearly demonstrated that a well-supplied, and this is key, well-motivated defender can effectively disrupt or even defeat a clearly superior adversary. If nothing else, this defender can significantly increase the cost and length and duration of a military conflict to the detriment of the attacker. So I think when you look at the overall lesson that's being looked at here, it's the fact that, as Bonnie said, this is far more complex than they might have imagined. And Joel has talked about it as well. While they still may feel that they have an advantage as the defending nation because the US has to project power, they also must take into account that Taiwan, with the appropriate hybrid and asymmetric capabilities, could make this a far more costly conflict than they originally anticipated. I mean, there's a number of other things at the operational level that they've learned, and I can go over those. But I think fundamentally at the strategic level is this issue of what a well-supplied, well-motivated defender can do to disrupt combat operations. And I'll stop there.
So Joel, do you share, I mean, we're getting some audience questions, so I'm going to pull them in, but this is an important point. Do you share that view? Because that would be a pretty big takeaway, essentially, if the conclusion is that this privileges the defense, that has some implications for the way they think about the use of kinetic defense.
Well, I think, there are undeniable, for the PLA, I think there are undeniable parallels with Taiwan, and these are not lost on the PLA, even if they're not so outspoken so far. And I think the reason is that, being outspoken would mean acknowledging Russia's failures and its shortcomings, which is not something that they really want to do publicly right now. So, but I think it's not a stretch of the imagination to think that they are observing the strength of the defense in Ukraine, the weaknesses of the offense, and how that would apply to a Taiwan situation. And so, I suspect in the near term, meaning the next couple of years, that would have a sort of downward pressure on their willingness to even think about doing something similar, and not just similar, but across a body of water under different, more difficult conditions in some ways. So I think in the next couple of years, that probably is the case. I think the real question, though, is over the longer term, over the next decade, perhaps, will this have allowed them to make sufficient changes in their own abilities? And so now they know how Ukraine's fighting, so now they might suspect how Taiwan might fight. And so are they going to build sufficient counters into their own way of war that would ultimately give them greater confidence in their own ability to offset those defensive advantages? And so would they, without the benefit of Ukraine, would they actually, with the benefit rather of Ukraine, would they actually be in the long term more confident, given everything that they may do to build up their arsenal, to strengthen their long range precision strike, to change their training regimens, et cetera, et cetera. But will this in the long term give them greater? I think that's really the thing that that I worry about more, not a near-term deadline or timetable or schedule, but really long-term confidence based on the things they may be building into their system based on this.
Is there anything they've done that they should feel better about as a result of what's happened to the Russians in Ukraine? I mentioned this NCO Corps issue before because I've seen a lot of commentary. So Hoop, that's interesting. You're shaking your head because I've seen a lot of commentary. The reason general officers keep getting killed in Ukraine is because they're having to deploy these guys forward because they don't have at the mid-levels the kind of operational capability. So should the Chinese feel better about where they are in terms of their force structure vis-a-vis the Russians? This goes to a question. Actually, Eric Gomez has a question in the chat box that I have here about she's military reforms, because I know a lot of those reforms are focused on training and learning practices. So on the training side, but also in terms of the force structure, are there things that they're observing the Russians where they should be filling their oats that they've done right that the Russians did wrong?
Well, let me talk first about this issue of NCO corps, the issue of cultural evolution of a military force. Okay, because what a lot of people don't understand about, for example, leadership, battle command, and NCO corps, is that the essence of the strength of these capabilities is cultural. It's not technical. It is, for example, in the case of a non-commissioned officer corps, it is the willingness of the senior officers to delegate authority and to accept the counsel of a subordinate in their command over their own judgment. And in doing so, gaining in stature among their forces instead of losing in stature among their forces. That's the essence and the strength of our non-commissioned officer corps. For example, me as a general, I had a sergeant major, and if I would do something and I'd propose to do something and I'd discuss it with him, and he'd say, "Sir, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard." Now I have two choices. I can get angry about it, or feel as if I've lost face, or I can accept his counsel and modify my plans based upon the wise counsel that he's given. In the US system, I gain in stature with my forces by doing that. In some other cultures, that would produce a loss of face and a challenge to authority that could not be countenanced. And so that's why you can form an NCO corps, but it may not be and likely won't be as effective in a Russian or a Chinese cultural context as it is in the US context. The second thing I'd raise for everybody is this issue of battle command. You're absolutely right, Evan. Russian officers keep getting killed because they don't trust their junior subordinates to give them an accurate picture of the battlefield. They're being pounded by Moscow to tell them what's going on, and they only trust their own judgment. Joel and Bonnie talked a little bit about this reorganization and delegation or breaking up of large formations into smaller formations. The success of that is predicated on active, adaptive combat leaders who are willing to use their own initiative during the rapid evolution of combat operations. And we have, and to illustrate that, we have a saying in our military, and in fact in our government, that fundamentally describes the cultural difference between the Chinese, Russian militaries and the US military. And every military officer learns it from the very beginning of his training, US. It's easier to beg for forgiveness than ask for permission. Now think about that from a cultural context. That's something that's learned by US military officers from the very beginning, which means that they learn to use and trust their own judgment in a rapidly evolving combat situation and explain their actions later on. And they anticipate that their leadership will support their actions, particularly if there's a favorable outcome. And these types of cultural tenets are not necessarily common to either Russian military culture or Chinese culture. And I didn't mean to go on, but I wanted to stop there and address those, because in modern warfare, those types of capabilities are absolutely essential to the success in an information warfare and in a hybrid warfare-based environment. And as we've seen in the Russian military, they simply don't exist.
No, that makes a lot of sense. So Joel, Bonnie, can you jump on that question, or maybe the more general question that Eric asked about how you assess Xi's reforms to the military?
So Evan, if you don't mind, if I could jump on the question of what did China see Russia do that it wouldn't have done or it would have done differently? Particularly if we're comparing this to Taiwan, I think China saw a couple of things that Russia did that was not great, or it was not, from China's perspective, did not seem to align what they thought the Russians were capable of. And I'm sure Joel can talk about this more when we get to the more detailed operational discussion. One was the use of information warfare, right? Information dominance. We did not see Russia was able to cut off Ukraine's ability to basically, Russia was not able to seize information dominance, right? So we saw Zelensky being able to communicate to his troops. We saw him be able to rally the public. We saw that Ukraine was able to communicate
at least their commands were able to communicate with each other. We saw that Ukraine was able to receive significant intelligence from the United States, but also from commercial means to target Russians. So this was not, as China was looking at in terms of the playbook of which they thought Russia would operate, that was not how they expected would happen. So that's one thing when China looks at Taiwan and other scenarios, they will try to improve. The other thing is when China looks at particular large-scale contingency, China tries to seize the initiative and tries to embrace elements of surprise. That's not what happened in Ukraine, right? We saw Russia massing troops for quite some time. And US intelligence even predicted that Russia would invade before Russia invaded. So there's a lot of things that as China watches the lead up to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that was not how China would have executed a Taiwan invasion. So that goes back to your original point of, as China looks at what's happening in Ukraine, I'm not sure that they will come up with a conclusion that we just talked about, that conflict favors the defender. I think the ways that China might have is don't make the mistakes that Russia did. And if we are going to make a major military operation against Taiwan, we need to move a lot faster, use a lot more force, make sure we have information dominance, and of course, not have many of the key problems that the Russian military have, including on the logistics side. So I don't think they're necessarily taking away that Taiwan could be as well defended, or Taiwan wouldn't necessarily do as well as Ukraine.
Okay. Who you look like you're chomping at the bit to come in on that.
No, I don't necessarily disagree with Bonnie. I think one of the biggest lessons, and I think one of the biggest lessons learned here, I think she captured a lot of them. But I will tell you, as somebody who in his last job was responsible for all foreign military sales, the first thing I learned was technology does not necessarily equate to a capability. And I think that that's a fundamental lesson to be drawn here. The Russians fired, we believe, a hypersonic missile. It got to its destination much faster than it would have otherwise, and it had absolutely negligible impact on this conflict.
But it was an apartment, wasn't it? An apartment complex,
right? But,
yeah,
but I mean, fundamentally, they fired this hypersonic weapon, and so what? Yeah. Okay, it just has not changed the nature of it. As the Russians learned in the initial stages of this conflict, operational doctrine and tactics matter. Logistics and geography matter. How they missed the fact that it rains every spring in Eastern Ukraine every spring. And a simple study of Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion, would have told them it's muddy in Ukraine every spring. But they somehow missed that fact. Education, training, leadership, and soldier morale, yours and your adversaries matter. The enemy gets a vote on your success. And so all of these are all lessons that while we are enamored with the advanced technological capabilities of the PLA, the question is, how will these lessons be learned and how will they be internalized? And we talk a lot about artificial intelligence, machine learning. Here on our side, we've abandoned man or woman in the loop. Now we talk about the man or woman on the loop, whatever that means. But I wonder, as Joel said, the PLA has read every book on fishing for the last 40 years, but they haven't gone fishing in a very long time. And there's a fundamental difference between practicing information-based warfare and reading about information-based warfare. So once again, I'll end where I began. It's only a lesson if you learn it.
Yeah. So Joel, you should jump in. But Bonnie teased that you might draw out a more operational and tactical competitive lesson.
Well, I think, and I agree with, Bonnie's point here that, the Chinese really want to achieve, if it's a Taiwan conflict, a quick victory, and Russia's failure to do that, I think is probably sort of a cautionary tale, and it just sort of justifies, choices that China has made doctrinally to, focus on things like decapitation strikes, information blockades, and so on. However, I do wonder whether or not Russia's failure to do this has perhaps prompted more thinking in China about what a protracted conflict could look like and what preparations they may need to undertake if, for instance, the battle goes on for more than a week or so. So are their munition stockpiles sufficient? Do they have adequate counterinsurgency type training in the PLA? What would, at the strategic level, what would it look like for China to be isolated for a very long period of time? What self-reliance would they need to institute? What kind of social mobilization, et cetera? And so I do wonder whether or not this will have finally unleashed some greater thinking about them, about what would happen if their initial onslaught fails. And, if they're able to do that, if they're able to prepare more effectively for a protracted conflict, why then I think they would actually have more confidence in getting into a conflict initially. And so that would be a worrisome set of developments, I think.
There are two questions from audience members that get at the question of false conclusions and also false analogies. One is from someone named Akira, who basically says, what are the risks attached to over comparing Ukraine to Taiwan in terms of logistics, strategy, rhetoric? That seems more like a question for Americans, because most of the over comparing of Ukraine to Taiwan seems to be happening in Washington, D.C., where I'm sitting, rather than in Ukraine or Moscow or Beijing or anywhere else. The second is from Brian Davis, who basically says, given that the Chinese Communist Party and the PLA have their own perspectives, and as all three of you pointed out, people's lessons are shaped by their perspectives. He asked, what are the wrong or inaccurate lessons they may be drawing from the Ukraine conflict? So one question is kind of pitched about what are the risks to us from over comparison? And then the other is pitched more at them. What are the risks of being prisoners of their own mindset so that they actually don't draw adaptive lessons, but the wrong lessons and conclusions? And I'll just throw that to the floor. Anybody want to jump in?
Well, go ahead.
Here, let's go Joel and then.
Maybe just to offer one initial thought. One of the potential wrong lessons would be concerning the ease with which you might be able to keep the United States out of a conflict, especially, the Chinese saw, Putin do this kind of thinly veiled nuclear signaling at the beginning, and the U.S. subsequently said, well, we're not going to enforce a no-fly zone, et cetera. And so I wonder whether the Chinese might think, well, if we do something very similar at the outset of a cross-strait conflict, the U.S. might just simply not intervene. I don't know, though. I think the Chinese, kind of deeply suspect that the U.S. would be committed, and they at least have to plan for the possibility of U.S. intervention. I worry whether or not they might overdo nuclear signaling and not understand the gravity, the depth of U.S. U.S. presidential administration's, willingness to say, look, forget that. We are so invested in this that we will. And so I think one of the messages that you have to send to the Chinese initially is to say, look, this nuclear saber rattling, this is absolutely not on the table, and this is not going to work, and you have a lot to lose if you go down that particular rabbit hole.
Two quick points, because I want to give Bonnie an opportunity to speak. Number one is, I think one of the flawed analogies here is if we do all of the things that the Russians didn't do, we will be successful. Okay, I think that's a huge flawed analogy and a huge logic flaw that we'll have to look at. The second is something that I've not seen a lot of people talk about, and that is the complete failure of strategic deterrence signaling and the reading of deterrence signaling on the part of both Russia and the United States as a prelude to the Ukrainian conflict. I was rereading John Toland's Rising Sun about the rise and fall of the Japanese Empire, and I was struck by the failure of strategic deterrence signaling between the United States and Japan before Pearl Harbor. We saw a similar failure of strategic deterrence signaling between the United States and Russia, and between NATO and Russia prior to the Ukrainian conflict. Both sides seem to misread signals. And I think that there should be some study given to the strategic signaling that could take place prior to Chinese military operations against Taiwan or against the United States, so that we have a much clearer understanding of what they are saying, which might both precede the conflict and hopefully help to avoid the conflict. And I'll stop there.
Bonnie, you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, sure. I want to echo what Joel and Jenna Hooper mentioned, and maybe add one potential incorrect lesson learned China might be taking away. I worry that as China looks at what is happening, both in terms of what happened after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but the general larger dynamics afterwards. A wrong lesson learned China might be taking away is Russia was forced to use force because it could not communicate its goals to the United States, to NATO in any other way. Even though they might disagree with how Russia used force or how Russia conducted itself on the battlefield, they might not disagree with the fact that Russia had legitimate reason to use force and Russia was forced to do so. So then if you mirror image that to China, China might find itself in a similar situation where it feels it has to use force in a similar situation as Russia, where it believes that all other means to achieve what it wants is not possible. That's a lesson learned that I'm very worried about, both in terms of short-term crises that China may think about provoking, but also longer-term, much higher escalation use of force, for example, in terms of the invasion scenario.
But don't you feel like the two sides are talking past each other on that? I mean, I remember in that famous testimony in 2004 where Jim Kelly, the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia, changed the U.S. formulation slightly. He talked about the status quo as we define it. We, the United States, define it. And the idea was to give the United States some operational and tactical flexibility in diplomacy, but also in modulating its own responses. But what I see now is the Chinese pointing the finger at the U.S. and saying, you're changing the status quo. You're injecting greater officiality. You're breaching your commitments in one China. We want a real one China policy, not a fake one China policy. That's what Foreign Minister Wang Yi said in an interview. And meanwhile, the United States for over a year has been saying, actually, China's the one changing the status quo. Look at what's happening in terms of the balance of forces. You're threatening, you're rattling the saber. So I mean this as an analytical statement, not a normative one. So without adjudicating that, if you're right, Bonnie, then that's a recipe for trouble, because then the two sides are actually, both sides, the lips are moving, but neither side is actually listening, either because their frame of reference doesn't process what the other side is saying because they don't want to walk in the other's shoes, or they're just talking past each other. So analytically, does that mean we're headed for trouble?
That's exactly what I mean by a failure of deterrent communication. I couldn't agree more with Bonnie. We are talking past each other. We're not really listening to each other, and we're not considering the messages that are being sent in the context of our opposite number as opposed to our own context.
Yeah. I mean, Ukraine didn't just suddenly up and happen on the 24th. I'm not sure how applicable it is to Ukraine, right? First, you had Crimea in 2014. So he's been hiving off parts of Ukraine now for close to a decade. And there's more history there. Hey, Hoop, when was the last time there was a successful, large-scale, multi-point amphibious invasion of anywhere?
September 15th, 1950.
Incheon?
Incheon.
Wasn't it one? That was like single point, right? One
Single point.
Yeah.
And there hasn't been one since, because it's remarkably difficult to do.
So it's hard.
It's very hard. Very, very hard.
And now they're observing standoff missile strikes and lots of, close combat infantry battles in Donbass and in the southeast of Ukraine.
And let's not forget that effectively or not, Taiwan and the United States have been preparing for this scenario for 70 years.
Yeah. Okay.
This one worst case scenario.
So we're at time. So I want to give you all like one last shot to kind of give the audience your, let's say, 2 headline takeaways from what you've observed since February. It could be lessons for China. It could be shifts they're going to make. It could be why they should be feeling smug or not. Bonnie, why don't we start with you?
Sure. I guess my quick 1 or 2 sentence summary is, as China assesses that its environment has become more dangerous and more uncertain, I think there is a greater risk that China might be willing to use force to defend against what it perceives as threats. So I think we are actually entering a period of greater potential sources of tension, not only in the Taiwan Strait, but around China's periphery.
Okay, Joel?
I think for me, first of all, the PLA is certainly observing this conflict. I think it will take quite some time if there are going to be lessons that translate into actual practice. This is something that will take, this is not, we're going to see a new PLA tomorrow that's much better prepared for a Taiwan conflict. I think this is a matter of years. You go from observation to absorption to real changes to ultimate. And so this is something that I think we need to watch over a very long period of time, even though this is a hot topic right now. The other thing that we didn't really mention in this discussion is really what are the lessons that Taiwan is taking out of this conflict, and really what are they going to do? Is this going to unlock something in their system which has been facing certain types of political gridlock around getting serious about defense for quite some time? But is this conflict really going to teach them something of value that will ultimately enhance deterrence across the strait, whether it's in terms of weaponry, whether it's in terms of cooperation with other countries, whether it's in terms of training and so on? I think this is a topic that I think really needs to be explored as well, because if Taiwan can learn greater lessons than China is taking away from this, then you may be able to keep that balance. If China's learning the lessons and Taiwan's not, then that's a much more difficult situation.
Right. Okay, Hoop, take us home.
There are no regional conflicts in the 21st century involving great powers. The Ukraine-Russia conflict has caused food shortages in Tunisia and vegetable oil shortages in Indonesia. And if we think that the global and rising oil prices, if we think the global implications of a Russia-Ukraine conflict are significant, wait until you see the global implications of a China-US conflict.
Okay, indeed. And on that cheery note, I am incredibly grateful to you three for spending some time with us and with the audience. And we had a good crowd, actually. So I'm grateful to everybody for tuning in. I mean, this is not the end of the story. The Ukraine war is a tragedy, and it looks like it's going to grind on for quite some time. So there'll be lots to observe, unfortunately. But, for us, this was an opportunity to think a little bit aloud about what the Chinese are learning, especially on the military side. So I'm grateful to all of you. Hoop, Joel, Bonnie, thanks. Thanks to the audience for joining us, and hope to see you again. Thanks very much. Bye, everybody.